Welcome to Screen Hollywood, the home of movie news and entertainment. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Chasing Marvel's formula and failing to establish a distinct cinematic identity, then December 2026 could become a very uncomfortable moment for the studio. Supergirl arrived as the second major theatrical chapter of the new DCU, and commercially, the numbers were brutal. James Gunn and Peter Safran were coming in with a 10-year plan, and suddenly, DC had the opportunity to become the dominant superhero brand again. But I think DC missed that window. Even when the movie was entertaining and occasionally ridiculous by modern standards, there was a serious undertone foundation underneath it. That's why Christopher Reeve's Superman has endured for decades. He didn't play Superman like he was in on the joke. He believed in Superman. I've been thinking about the DC universe for quite some time, and I've come to a conclusion that I don't think enough people are talking about. Everybody is saying the same thing. The DCU is struggling. James Gunn has lost the plot. The movies aren't connecting. The characters aren't working. Marvel is coming back, and the whole thing is falling apart. But those arguments are incredibly shallow, because the real question isn't, is the DCU failing? The more interesting question is, why? What has actually gone wrong? Because if you look at the evidence, something very strange is happening. DC had an enormous opportunity. Marvel was coming off years of audience fatigue. The MCU had lost a lot of its momentum. There was genuine excitement surrounding the idea of a completely rebuilt DC universe. James Gunn and Peter Safran were coming in with a 10-year plan, and suddenly, DC had the opportunity to become the dominant superhero brand again. But I think DC missed that window. And now, Marvel is beginning to come back. With Avengers Doomsday generating enormous attention, the balance of power may be shifting again. And that brings us to the biggest problem facing James Gunn's DCU. I don't think DC knows what it wants to be. Let's go back to 2025. Superman arrived carrying an enormous amount of responsibility. This wasn't simply another Superman movie. It was the opening chapter of James Gunn's new DC universe. And to be fair, the movie wasn't a disaster. It received strong reviews. It made around $618 million worldwide. That's not nothing. But here's the problem. I'm not even talking about the money. I'm talking about the reaction. Because this was supposed to be the movie that reignited DC. The film that made audiences say, I'm back in. The beginning of the next great superhero universe. And instead, the reaction was much more complicated. Yes, plenty of people liked the movie. The audience score remained strong, so I'm not going to pretend the public universally hated it. But it didn't generate the overwhelming cultural explosion that DC desperately needed from the launch of its new universe. It didn't become The Dark Knight. It didn't become Avengers. It didn't become Iron Man. It became a Superman movie people debated. And that's a very different thing from creating a phenomenon. That's the distinction I'm making. Because when you're trying to build a cinematic universe, respectable isn't necessarily enough. Marvel didn't build the MCU on respectable. It built it on events. Audiences weren't simply watching Iron Man. They were discovering something. They wanted to know what came next. That level of anticipation is what DC needed, and it didn't quite happen. And this is where things became much more serious. Supergirl arrived as the second major theatrical chapter of the new DCU, and commercially, the numbers were brutal. The movie opened to approximately $38 million domestically and $68 million worldwide, against a reported $170 million budget, with later reporting projecting substantial losses. That's not an opinion. Those are the numbers. And the problem goes beyond the money. The character didn't connect with the general audience in the way DC needed. Now, before somebody jumps down my throat, I'm not saying absolutely nobody liked Millie Alcock. That's obviously nonsense. The current verified audience score is actually reasonably positive. But that's not the point. The point is cultural impact. Where was the explosion? Where was the obsession with Supergirl? Where was the massive general audience conversation? Where was the feeling that DC had just introduced its next superstar? It simply wasn't there at the level the studio needed. And Millie Alcock's version of Kara Zor-El didn't immediately become the cultural icon DC needed her to become. That's a problem. Because Supergirl wasn't some obscure side project. This was supposed to be part of the foundation. And instead, it became another conversation about whether the DCU is actually working. And here's where I think the real problem lies. Forget the box office for a minute. Forget James Gunn, forget Marvel, forget Superman, forget Supergirl. Look at the DC brand itself. Because something jumped out at me. What are the most successful DC productions of the modern era? Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, Matt Reeves' The Batman, The Penguin, even Zack Snyder's Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, whatever you think of them, created enormous cultural conversation. And there's a common denominator. They're serious, they're grounded, they're atmospheric, they're often dark. They deal with real human problems: corruption, crime, politics, trauma, mental illness, power, fear, death, moral ambiguity. These aren't children's stories dressed up in superhero costumes. They're stories about human beings who happen to exist in extraordinary circumstances. And that's where I think DC has lost its identity. And this is where I want to make something very clear. When I talk about DC being darker and more serious, I'm not saying Superman has to be Batman. Look at Christopher Reeve's Superman. Those movies were colorful. They had humor. They had charm. They had romance. They had moments that were genuinely fun. But underneath all of that, there was seriousness. Richard Donner's Superman treated the character with enormous sincerity. Superman wasn't a punchline. The stakes mattered. Clark Kent mattered. Lois Lane mattered. The people Superman was trying to save mattered. Even when the movie was entertaining and occasionally ridiculous by modern standards, there was a serious undertone foundation underneath it. That's why Christopher Reeve's Superman has endured for decades. He didn't play Superman like he was in on the joke. He believed in Superman, and audiences believed him. That's what I'm talking about when I say DC needs to rediscover its identity. Darkness doesn't mean everything has to be miserable. Seriousness means the characters matter, and that's a massive difference. This is the part I find fascinating. Look at the names that have passed through DC's cinematic history. Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson, Kim Basinger, Michelle Pfeiffer, Val Kilmer, Jim Carrey, Danny DeVito, Christian Bale, Heath Ledger, Tommy Lee Jones, Cillian Murphy, Michael Caine, Morgan Freeman, Joaquin Phoenix, Tom Hardy, Colin Farrell, Robert Pattinson, Anne Hathaway, and that list keeps going. That's an extraordinary collection of acting talent, and I don't believe that's an accident. DC gives actors dramatic material to work with. That's the key. These aren't just costumes. These are characters with psychological depth. Batman isn't simply Batman. Bruce Wayne is psychologically damaged. Joker isn't simply a villain. He's a study in chaos, mental illness, and society. Penguin isn't just a comic book gangster. He's a character study. That's why the Penguin worked. That's why Joker worked. That's why the Batman worked. And that's why I believe DC's biggest asset isn't actually Superman. It's the dramatic potential of the characters. The MCU isn't really performance-driven. And here's another point that I think gets overlooked. Marvel's greatest strength is not necessarily dramatic acting. It's spectacle, interconnected storytelling, character familiarity, and entertainment. That's what makes the MCU work, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when you compare the two brands, I don't think Marvel gives actors the same kind of dramatic playground that DC can provide. In the MCU, an actor can be buried underneath CGI. They can be surrounded by 20 characters. The movie can be moving at 100 miles an hour. There are often jokes sitting right next to emotional scenes. It's an ensemble machine. DC, when it's done properly, can slow down. It can put an actor in a room, give them a conversation, give them a psychological conflict, give them something to actually play. And that's why I believe some of Hollywood's biggest dramatic actors are attracted to DC when the material is right. Because these roles can become serious acting showcases. Heath Ledger didn't win an Oscar because Batman had good CGI. Joaquin Phoenix didn't win an Oscar because Joker had a great connected universe. Those films gave actors room to perform. That's the difference. And that is an asset DC should be protecting. And this is where I'm probably going to annoy some Marvel fans. I believe the DC brand is more prestigious than Marvel. There, I've said it. Don't kill me in the comments. I'm not saying DC has made more successful movies. Obviously it hasn't. I'm saying something different. When DC gets the right script and the right filmmaker, it attracts an extraordinary level of talent. Because these characters can be treated like serious dramatic material. And Hollywood's biggest actors know that. That's the secret sauce. Now let's be fair to James Gunn. Gunn is extremely talented. I have enjoyed some of his work enormously. Guardians of the Galaxy was fantastic. And I'm not arguing that he doesn't understand filmmaking. He clearly does. But here's my question. Is James Gunn's particular filmmaking DNA the right DNA for DC? Because Gunn's style is built around irreverent humor, absurdity, color, music, characters who behave like complete lunatics, emotional moments surrounded by comedy. And that's brilliant, when it's appropriate. It worked beautifully with Guardians. It worked with the Suicide Squad. It worked with Peacemaker. But DC is a gigantic universe, and when that Gunn-style sensibility becomes too dominant, I think something gets lost. The gravitas. And this distinction is important. James Gunn himself has said DC doesn't have a single company style, and that different projects should have their own tones. And I actually agree with that philosophy. Clayface, for example, is being positioned as a horror movie. That's exactly what I want. Give filmmakers room. Let Clayface be horror. Let Lanterns be a serious mystery. Let Batman be noir. Let Superman be hopeful. But the problem is that the overall brand still needs an identity. And I don't know what the new DCU's identity is yet. That's the problem. And here's the timing problem. DC had a window. Marvel had lost momentum. Audiences were complaining about formula. The MCU was struggling to produce the kind of cultural events it had created during the Infinity Saga. This was DC's chance. Instead of trying to become Marvel, DC should have said, "We're going to be DC." And now, look at the landscape. Avengers Doomsday is generating enormous anticipation. Marvel is bringing back major legacy characters. The X-Men are entering the conversation. Robert Downey Jr. is back in a completely different role. Steve Rogers is back in the picture. Nostalgia is working overtime. And whether you love it or hate it, people are talking about Marvel again. That's what DC needed to achieve. And now we have Superman, Man of Tomorrow, coming in 2027. This is incredibly important, because the first Superman movie was supposed to establish the universe. The sequel now needs to prove that the audience actually wants to continue with it. That's a completely different challenge. If Supergirl had exploded at the box office, the DCU would have momentum. Instead, the franchise is heading into its next Superman movie, having just experienced a significant commercial setback. That puts pressure on Gunn, because now the question becomes, can Superman actually become the anchor of this universe? Here's my solution. Stop trying to beat Marvel at being Marvel. You can't. Why would you even want to? Marvel already owns that territory. DC should take the opposite direction. Embrace the darkness. Not misery, not endless gray cinematography, not every character being tortured. I'm talking about maturity. Give us stories with consequences. Give us filmmakers with strong visual identities. Give us characters who aren't constantly making jokes. Give actors dramatic material. And stop being afraid of letting these movies breathe.
And this is where I'm going to throw something controversial onto the table. Matt Reeves. Look at what happened with the Batman. Look at the Penguin. Those projects were connected to the same world and managed to create something DC desperately needs. Credibility. They didn't feel like copies of Marvel. They felt like DC. Dark, beautiful, atmospheric, grounded, adult, and critically respected. That's the direction I believe DC should be exploring. I'm not saying fire James Gunn. I'm not saying Reeves should personally direct every DC production. I'm saying DC needs more Reeves-style thinking at the top. Because somebody needs to protect the identity of this brand. And here's the nightmare scenario. Imagine Avengers Doomsday arrives in December. It becomes a gigantic cultural event. Marvel gets its momentum back, and meanwhile DC is sitting there trying to convince audiences that its cinematic universe is the future. That's the battle. Not Marvel versus DC in some childish internet war. It's about cultural relevance. Who owns the superhero conversation? Right now, I think DC is in danger of losing it, and that is astonishing when you consider the opportunity they had. So no, I don't think the DCU is dead, not remotely. It's far too early to say that, and there are projects coming that could completely change the conversation. Clayface could surprise everybody. Lanterns could build a serious television audience. Man of Tomorrow could reignite Superman. And there are still major characters waiting in the wings. But something needs to change. Because throwing more superheroes onto the screen isn't the answer. More CGI isn't the answer. More jokes aren't the answer. More interconnected storytelling isn't automatically the answer. Identity is the answer. DC needs to remember what made people fall in love with DC in the first place. The darkness, the mythology, the humanity, the prestige, the seriousness, the willingness to take these characters seriously. And yes, the ability to give world-class actors roles they can actually sink their teeth into. That's where DC has always had an advantage. And if James Gunn can embrace that, rather than trying to make DC into another version of Marvel, I think he can still turn this around. But if DC continues drifting between tones, chasing Marvel's formula and failing to establish a distinct cinematic identity, then December 2026 could become a very uncomfortable moment for the studio. Because when Avengers Doomsday arrives, Marvel won't care about DC's 10-year plan. They'll be coming for the audience, and DC needs to be ready. That's all I've got. What do you think? Has James Gunn's DCU actually failed, or am I identifying a problem that can still be fixed? And most importantly, what is the DCU's identity right now? Let me know in the comments. This is Screen Hollywood. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Also, bookmark and subscribe to our news site at screenhollywood.com. Beyond the headlines. See you in the next one.